Greetings and welcome back. I'm joined by my friend and guest, Mr. Novak, again. And today we're going to be talking about a topic which is, I guess, broadly considered almost a meme. That is generations, generational gaps. I mean, everyone's a boomer. Some people are zoomers, et cetera, et cetera. Traditional definitions and delineations of what starts when and where, that's not really widely regarded. But I think today we're going to try an earnest discussion about the different generations and how they differ and the different problems that have arisen. And really, I think what I probably want to focus on is the younger and youngest generations, because they're the ones in terms of the technological landscape and the environment that are most far removed from the previous generations, which, obviously just due to that reason bore much more similarity to each other. So I guess we can skip the silent generation, boomers. Boomers are kind of a meme, right? But they're real, and the things they did had consequences for the rest of us. And boomers kind of get a bad rap. So maybe the first question I'm going to ask Mr. Novak is, who's done a fair bit of research on this topic. It's a meme, yes, but why are boomers the sort of the source of all evil, so to speak?
Yeah. First of all, thanks for having me back. And this is definitely a topic that I hope is discussed more broadly with your audience and hopefully more people in general. When we look at the differences between generations and how the differences are becoming larger and larger, the disparities between almost every metric is becoming greater as time goes on. But when it comes to the boomers, I think there's a lot of resentment for multiple reasons. One is the amount of wealth that they've been able to accumulate, and how things like Social Security, cost of living, educational attainment, just the different struggles that they went through relative to perhaps younger generations was a bit different. Every generation has their challenges, but it seems like they definitely had one of the best setups ever. And I've heard many people say that they are the richest generation of all time. So I can see why there's a lot of resentment there and frustration. It also seems to be a good amount of indifference, a good amount of apathy coming from boomers when it comes to the issues in my generation, your generation, and certainly the youngest, Gen Z. All of this kind of, accumulates to, a pretty bad rap for the boomers. So that's probably just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, and I definitely agree. Just sort of obviously anecdotally, boomers had a nice setup. Particularly in Europe, I know I talk about the U.S. as well, but with the social safety net, everything was sort of well regulated, well structured. Everything was kind of taken care of in a way that it's no longer the case. And I know there's a lot of negativity directed towards the boomers, and I can understand that. But to offer some sympathy, and by the way, I'm Gen X. A lot of people call me a boomer. It's kind of a joke by now, or meme, but no, I'm not actually a boomer. I was born in the 70s, so I'm Gen X. Is that everybody has difficulty foreseeing the future. Nobody knows exactly what's going to happen. And you have to think about when the boomers start, which is 46 to 69 off the top of my head, something like that, or early 70s even. You have that.
That 46 to 64. That's right.
Oh, 64, right. That the difference in the landscape, especially in terms of technology, between when they're around and your average Zoomer or Gen Z or Z, it's so vast. And so I think that the boomers, through human fallibility and ignorance, mistakenly assume that the system that they helped set up, received from the silent generation and generations before them, that system would go on essentially in perpetuity, which obviously is not the case, could never be the case, but that sort of comfy, You get a job, everything's set up, you get a pension. In states, you have Social Security, blah, blah. That would just kind of go on. And the cream, the cream of the crop here, or rather I guess the final justification for this in their narrative was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. You can see, okay, this whole system, it's great. Ronald Reagan, the hero. By the way, he wasn't a hero. I know there are probably some Reagan fans, but he's a lot of screwed up things. No-fault divorce, you can thank him for that, among other things. But anyway, fall of communism, the wall falls, all this stuff, and they think, oh, yeah, see, we're vindicated in our beliefs. Everything's turned out fine. I don't think that. So I understand the resentment, but I also understand how they could have become infatuated with a vision of the world that seemed to work so well at the time for such an extended period of time. And of course, they weren't the only generation. The silent generation, which was 28 to 45, pushed this notion that education is the key to everything. That's where, particularly in the U.S., above all in the U.S., less so in Europe, you get this notion that everyone needs to go to university or college. Everyone needs to get a degree. Because you get that degree, everything turns out better. And if I remember the stats, which are quite distant in my head, that has historically been true over the last 5 decades, that people with quote-unquote college degrees in the U.S., they were earning better, they had better, well, they earn more, basically. And people, that's part of the U.S. mentality, I guess, turned things into an economic mill, so universities over time became that too. But I think they just became sort of sated and glutted on the seeming efficacy of their own system, assuming it would just go on forever. Once Francis Fukuyama in 92 writes The End of History, and everything is sort of vindicated. You see liberal democratic capitalism won the day and all our problems are solved, and I guess it's everything's going to be really easy from now on. I want to offer some commentary on Generation X, which I belong to that, and I know there's something called the Lost Generation, but well, actually, that's technically I forgot which one that is in terms of. There's also the Lost Generation in terms of Australian history. I don't want to go into that. That's something to do with kidnapping Aboriginal children. I'm trying to remember what the Lost Generation is in technical terms, but I do feel that increasingly Gen X is this lost generation, since we get thrown in with boomers and maybe even millennials. And we were kind of a transitional generation where a lot of the stuff was not known to us. Because I mean, me doing the old man speech where, if I wanted to find something out and I had to walk across the town to the library, yeah, I did, right? And maybe the library didn't have the book I was looking for, so I was kind of screwed. Or you hated people with, nines in their freaking phone numbers because, it was a rotary phone and you have to dial multiple times and that sort of thing. Yeah. And just certain, and this is consequential, other things we'll be discussing, social responsibility, social interaction, etiquette, things like that. Well, in the 80s, which I remember reasonably well, if you had an appointment with somebody, not just like with a friend, there was no, yeah, bro, man, I'm going to be late like 15 minutes. I'm going to come up tomorrow. I need to slay some pussy, bro. Is that a problem? That didn't exist because it was an elaborate thing. First off, you had to assume you got lucky. Maybe the person's at home. It was a big deal. So you didn't typically cancel the social responsibilities. So I remember that time, which was much more reminiscent and resembled more the boomer time. But at the same time, and this is my own anecdotal feeling, but also having spoken to a few other people in my generation, I think we got hit pretty hard by the same hammer that a lot of the millennials and the Zoomers are complaining about, in the sense that we too were urged, probably even more vociferously than some others, to go to college, university. That's what my parents told me. And I was also told that it didn't matter what I studied, you just got to get a degree. Study hard, do well, get a degree, and everything will be fine. And by the time I was in university in the 90s, that prediction and the accuracy of that prediction was not entirely true. You already had a shift away from, I think, based on a little bit of study, but also a lot of anecdotal stuff I've been looking through my entire life and speaking to other people, that it wasn't enough just to get a degree. And that university, that's where I really begin, and maybe it's because the first time I started paying attention, I saw people getting lots and lots of debt, university debt,
Sure.
drowning in it, taking a long, long time to pay it off, and the people still,
So,
yeah.
it's odd that I know more about the boomers and Gen Z, and I'm a millennial. I was born in 91. I would say Gen X is the one I know the least amount about. And so
Because we're the
what was
forgotten
kind of,
generation, yeah.
yeah, there you go. There you go. It's
Yeah.
verified. But I think you're dead on when you talk about you were a transitional generation,
Big time. Yeah.
in many ways. And I think technology and, definitely cultural shifts had a lot to do with it. What was the zeitgeist like in the 80s going into the 90s? And what else did you see start changing in terms of, the social norms of how the typical picket fence life arc was no longer going to be the case? You mentioned things like formal education was not going to be the end all
College debt.
for success, and debt.
Well, I
what
think
else were you starting to see?
nobody really saw that in the 80s, I don't think. People still clung very much to these old paradigms, and you just went through the motions. Of course, the 80s probably was the last, I don't want to call it pre-tech, but kind of pre-tech decade, because only really wealthy people had mobile phones, and there were these big clunky things. You didn't want to walk around. They looked like a couple of people had pagers. I knew a few people in the late 80s that had pagers, that kind of looked like pimps and whatever. But
I'm just old enough to remember these the bag with the phone, the large brick-like cell phones, and everybody had a beeper. It was the new thing, the new cool thing.
But most people didn't have that, and again, it was still primitive for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
90s that changed, and I think that's where you first see with the internet, and especially in college environment, this change in things. Things are just not guaranteed as much. Everyone, all my teachers, mentors, they all followed, you want to call it the boomer, whatever, this previous received wisdom.
Lifestyle.
Yeah. You study hard, go get a job, everything will be fine. And I found out the hard way that, that's not the case. I did pretty well at university. I studied some pretty arcane things, but I found out, to much to my chagrin, that there were no jobs guaranteed just because of that, and that I had to, engage in further study to get some sort of qualification that would make me a quote-unquote teacher, blah-de-blah, that sort of thing. And I mean, that was always sort of the case, but I think that the main thing I'd say about that one point is that the received wisdom in the past was already crumbling by the mid-90s.
Right.
One thing that I think we did not experience, and this speaks to this whole FA phenomenon, is that somewhat, I don't think I'm exceptional. Average-looking guys like myself, to the extent that even mattered, you could get laid, you could hook up. It wasn't this big mysterious thing, right? It happened, and that's something that I guess still stuck around. But the technology was changing, and I think the big thing that happened in this forgotten generation, Generation X, is there was way too much optimism, and a lot of it was self-deception. Because again, you're just finishing Gen X with books like The End of History and Proclamations, and this feeling of really exuberant triumph that everything fell apart with the Soviet Union, and everything's going to be liberalized capitalist democracy, and everything's going to be fine. And then it turns...
Do you think that's where a lot of the optimism came from? We look back at the nostalgia of the 80s and 90s. A lot of people do. Do you think that's kind of one of the flashpoints or one of the pivotal moments was the fall of the Berlin Wall? And
because if you've been through this Cold War for decades, since the end of World War II, or arguably even before that,
Sure.
You're
Yeah.
looking at something like that as the culmination and the vindication of your life philosophy, in some cases, political philosophy, of all those efforts. Like, yeah, we screwed up in Vietnam and we were involved in military coups across the world
Hmm.
and a lot of bad things, but hey, it finally worked out, right? And that sort of thing. And people, and this from a political perspective, but I think most people felt optimism in the grand American vision and how democracy would spread. I mean, Amy Chua, this law professor slash political scientist at Yale, talks about this in one of her earlier books. How there was this assumption that okay, it's done in the '90s. We're just going to spread the gospel, liberal capitalist democracy, and everything's going to be fine. Because you see in that the seeds of failure to many of the foreign policy blunders of the early 2000s, and well, arguably continually.
Absolutely.
Where, for example, okay, the end of history. So now we just got to export quote unquote democracy, whatever the hell that means, to all these third world shanty countries, and it's going to work out fine. Everything will be no problems, right?
Utopia, here we come. Right.
Pretty much, and it's understandable, but that was the blindness because the policymakers and people that sort of blithely, that is, everyday men and women on the ground supporting that, just kind of went along with it because there's that American exceptionalism, right? And American exceptionalism, I think, really finds its apogee in Gen X, maybe in the late '80s, possibly. Where, I mean, where else do you get this notion that Ronald Reagan was a hero? I mean,
Right.
look at his actual policies, what he did. He certainly wasn't conservative, he did a lot of things that, he brought in motion with no-fault divorce in '69 as governor of California, all this other stuff. But that vision that, okay, America's so good, we've done it. Now, rather than looking, I mean, there are different ways you can look at. I'm not a political historian or historian otherwise, but they're sort of two, you could say, competing visions that you can use to look at the collapse of the Soviet Union more broadly, the Second World as it was referred to. And that was, the valiant efforts of noble America, capitalist America, fighting the good fight,
Right.
or did the Soviet Union and the Second World just wear itself out through a system that just wasn't very functional, and it would have happened anyway? I lean more towards the latter, I have to say. And so a lot of this self-congratulatory nonsense that went on in the late '80s and early '90s was not helpful, because the other thing, and I think this is one of the most salient points, we'll get back to the more sort of pedestrian stuff, but in terms of just global
Sure.
politics, is that when you got rid of communism, whether it was gotten rid of or just wore itself out, it doesn't really matter. The biggest bugbear of all is gone, and you don't really have that anymore. But these people are running the show, are trapped. Not necessarily Gen X. We're trapped in the middle of this, but the boomers and the silent generation. This notion that that's all they've known. If you were born, you're born in the '40s. That's what you grew up with. I mean, I heard stories from people I knew that grew up during the '50s. Those bomb drills and
Right.
things like that. It's
Hide
hard
under
to
the desk. Yep.
it's hard to get out of that mentality, and then enter a new world where the fundamentals of the world do not revolve around competing ideologies that seem to be the sort of the modern religions of our time almost. And that's done, and then what do you have? I mean, what do you have left? And so the boomers lost sight. I would say, we're the lost generation, the forgotten, misinformed. We were just woefully misinformed going forward, some of us at least. And we received a lot of the misinformation, and you could say poorly, well, false wisdom, we'll call it that, because I think the wisdom, it was well intended, but it wasn't actual wisdom, that
Hmm.
subsequent generations did, mostly in the decisions we had to make about economics, about education, but also the optimism. I mean, certainly for sure, more Gen X people are quote unquote happily married and whatever, compared to millennials and
Oh
Zoomers.
yeah. I mean, everything,
Mm.
family, career,
Yeah, but
Well,
it's where it starts.
everything's slowly
And
been
I saw the cracks, looking back, and I saw the cracks emerging.
right.
And, but nobody was aware of what that meant. Now we know in 2019 what that meant. It's the current, the current year, basically, right? But looking back on it, scratching my head, saying in the late night, wait a second, I got this degree, I got this, and man, it's not that hard, easy to find a job. Don't just give me a job for this, and I have to do more of this and that, and it just
Right.
it wasn't the promised land. And I think that, yeah, if we are the forgotten generation, it's because we are in that transitional period where we received this wisdom. It turned out not to be very wise in the end. And also, we can remember, it's like the Bronze Age, where there was no internet and things like that. And so it makes sense because our generation, we didn't really define anything. We received this lopsided vision of the world, which by the time, essentially, give or take a few years, by the time our generation officially is over, it's done.
Hmm.
The great clash of civilizations between the second and first world, and what's left after that. Because I think the generations are more, in my opinion, this is just my own opinion, tend to be much more defined by excuse me, tired, peculiarities that they experience that differentiate them from other generations. Whereas Gen X is
Right.
just this
Right.
thing, like, yeah,
Well,
we
that's
had
kind of
yeah. Sorry, please.
no. That's exactly what I was going to ask. But first off, I have a boomer question for you.
Okay,
You're not hearing my notification sound go off, are you?
no,
Okay, very good. So, um, you talk about you being you talked about how you're one of those who kind of noticed things starting to come apart, earlier than maybe others within your generation.
mm,
Some things I was thinking about is in the 1970s, and I know that you were extremely young,
yeah.
but was there any sort of sign or notice of how the economy worldwide was shifting more to that globalist,
Well, I was but
paradigm
a
we have
child
now in terms of
again.
manufacturing to service industries? I know you were quite young, but
Well, I could tell you more about the '80s when I had more sort of cognizance of these things. Because again, I was but
sure.
a young child. Yeah, well, I think the emergence of shopping malls per se as a kind of permanent fixture of American life,
Hmm.
that, and this is totally subjective. I have not done research on this. Seemed to be much more prominent in the '80s. Seemed to be a growing phenomenon where you drive out here and there's all this stuff available and what have you. That seemed to be changing. Well, the big thing, I mean, speaking of manufacturing, the big thing in the '80s was
Yeah.
Japan. Japan was, this is before the zombie bank crisis. I had this Japanese friend growing up. His father was some big shot in some Japanese company. Went back to Japan eventually. Masatake was his name. And I mean, they were the bomb, so to speak. They would, you wanted Japanese cars, Japanese electronics, all that sort of thing. That
My parents both owned Hondas in the
Yes,
80s, so
my
yep.
father had a Toyota for years before it finally gave way. Um, and so I don't know if that's a direct indication, but the preference for, say, Japanese products, eh, shown by many people that I was growing up with, people more
Hmm.
broadly, seemed to suggest that maybe the manufacturing legacy of the United States or its greatness was slowly coming. I mean, nobody was in a panic. No one was saying, "Oh man, Toyota's taking over." Although some people were, but that didn't. That wasn't. It was. It was again. You see the cracks emerge, but you have to look back on it with retrospect. It's not as if
Sure.
you're in that moment, of course, and you're looking at everything, but you're not. At least I'm not thinking at the time. As a very young person, well, this is what's happened. But putting it back in the context to see where it's led, whether it comes to the college industrial complex,
Right.
the false promises of education and gainful employment, or in this case, I think increasingly electronics, the cool electronics were the Japanese ones, not the. Fuck, I can't even think of. I'm trying to think of a good, reliable, sort of American product, electronics product producer. From then, I can't even. I
Nothing
can't.
comes to mind,
Yeah.
to be
So,
honest.
and that used to exist before my time, even. And so you already see that, and then of course you fast forward now, and there, Korea's a giant, and China. There are all these other factors. Um, this is kind of a very sobering perspective, but
Sure.
if you want to look at the loss of American greatness, say in the manufacturing realm, really politically, really just brought more broadly, it could just be the natural attenuation of all nations, maybe even empires, that things change and other people catch on. I'll give you an example. I mean, this is there are many reasons why the Roman Empire fell. For a long time, Roman military tactics were pretty much unparalleled, and nobody else really knew how to defeat them. And all right, but over time, people learn. It's like Chinese are all copycats. Well, maybe, but they're doing a pretty good
Right.
job of it. Well, it just so happens that they start recruiting foreigners. Not only they learn the Roman uh, military techniques, they start applying it themselves, and the secrets are out. And that's another factor that had a lot to do with quote unquote globalization and liberalization. That some places did take advantage of that. I mean, Korea is another great example of that. They just exploded in terms economically. They're I mean, Samsung is a huge thing. People use all their products all the time.
They're
So I,
great.
yeah,
I'm a fan. So,
yes, yeah. So I think what you're seeing from a retrospective, effectively, is that those cracks are emerging in this case, Japanese electronic domination, automobile manufacturing in the
mm,
90s, with education being not the way it is now, where it's just, I mean, you have to be insane to go for one of these degrees, I think, but it's beginning to shake. But you only realize that when you look back on it, because at the time, I was just thinking, wait, every this isn't working out the way they said it would or should, especially with the education and employment issue. And well,
well, I would be remiss if I didn't ask.
hmm,
Um, Second wave feminism is kind of going through during your generation. Um,
didn't get much of that. I wanted to actually talk about that. I would say at first to comment on that would be to comment on the university situation, because that's where it seems to be most acute these
mm,
days. Because I have a close friend that's a millennial. He used to tell me stories back in the day when he was at university, things that were unheard of. That even in the humanities, when I was going to university in the 90s, you could get away from that. You were not going to really. I mean, I studied the humanities. Admittedly, not many people study classics, but you could get
right.
away from a lot of that. But when you wanted to do, say, modern literature, and I had to do when I was doing German, some modern literature classes, you would get some of that, but it's not
Mm,
like it is today. Again, I think the recurrent theme here is that the cracks are beginning to emerge, but you only realize it retrospectively, and that's what I see, especially in the university with feminism. Um, in the workforce, it's kind of hard because I was a teacher, and I mean, what I can comment on, I didn't notice much feminism. Obviously, overwhelmingly, most teachers, especially language teachers, are female. So a lot of my people I worked with were female. Say what you want about that, but
fun.
sometimes that the issue there really were increasingly lax standards. Now, we are all familiar with the whole, Timmy, Tom, and Toddle. They all need a medal, irrespective of how well they've done, and that sort of thing.
Right.
Is that idea that everyone needs to be a winner? That started emerging probably in the late '90s, sort of 2000s.
Yeah,
That yeah.
this was kind of when the psychology started coming out with the concept of self-esteem, and I think it kind of branched off from that it's
Yeah.
feeling good is the most important thing, and I think even from there, we see the fragility of parenting, the helicopter parenting, and
Mm.
the over the overabundance of concern for safety.
Yeah.
And
But just
yeah,
the cracks, again, this is this recurrent thing. I can only look at it from the past and see all the connections now, but the time there, it's like you're picking up something in the wind. It smells a bit odd, but it doesn't really point in any one direction until much later when you realize, oh, that actually was a dragon or something, right?
right.
So, yeah, that's I think the biggest thing with regards to feminism is I just didn't see much of it at university. Admittedly, my subjects were in the humanities, but things I suppose at the time were immune or not somewhat untouched. But now, surprisingly, everything, whatever you want to call it, cultural Marxism, this kind of indoctrination, it's in every humanities department. Every
explicitly almost at this point. Like
yes,
it's unapologetic.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. This is a year ago. Like, a friend of mine challenged me to just look at, because my big thing is medieval history, just look at different history departments in the U.S., different universities, and check out the specialties, especially medieval history. Yeah, and it used to be, different things, calligraphy, medieval, like normal things.
Damn. Awesome.
Right, and then I looked and I was thinking, women in the church and women in that, and you see all this stuff, and the perception of minorities during the Middle Ages, and what we've come to expect, rather than I guess what you could regard as proper subjects. And so, for example, my Latin teacher was a historian of the late Middle Ages and a specialist.
Even that class is showing at the Times, by the way. Your Latin teacher, just so far gone from the normal academic options available in the social sciences and humanities in general.
Yeah, and he was
sadly,
he was a specialist in medieval manuscripts and specific. And I don't want to go into too many details. But the point is that I mean, these things were coming on. And then I fast forward, 20 years later, and everything, it's what you expect. Women this, the women in the Renaissance, right? And much to my chagrin, I encountered this guy maybe 2 or 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. There was a time when I almost ended up at Cambridge University in the United Kingdom to pursue this program or this department called Anglo-Saxon Celtic North. It's for basically people interested in medieval Northern Europe, as I've been for quite some time.
Badass.
Yeah, and then I talked to this guy who apparently had been enrolled, and he told me he's now studying economics, or he's going to. It's been taken over. It's basically homoeroticism in the Norse sagas, and sort of women, the usual things you'd come to expect.
Heteronormative, patriarchal studies of the
basically
the
it's turned
important stuff, the relevant stuff.
Yeah, so that's one of the hugest difference I see, because that was not so prominent that I could notice it when I was young and studying these subjects. A lot of things were done by the book. I remember doing a very kind of interesting Western Civilization 101. I'm not even sure if that exists, but I'm willing to bet money if Western Civilization 101 exists, it's not taught in the way it was taught to me, which was largely big events, sequential events, trying to get the gist of, I guess you could say, the order of how things went, came to pass.
Came to be.
Yeah,
right.
That sort of thing. I don't think it'd be like that anymore. Nobody railed about the core curriculum or what have you. And yeah, now I'm trying to.
Did you notice any? Sorry. Did you notice any activism? Like you had like the free speech movement, the Cultural Revolution in the '60s, and was your generation, in terms of activism, was there anything notable? Because as far as I can tell, I don't think there really was. Maybe anti-war protests, perhaps.
Not really, because that's the whole thing. No? We were this transitional, forgotten generation. All the bad stuff, in air quotes, had happened, right? There's the Vietnam War. Most of us were born after that. I was born after Nam.
Korean War.
Korean, all this
Yep.
stuff. So what were your protests? You were just supposed to follow the protocol that the boomers and the silent generation gave you. But what I did notice, let me just drink some water, and I can relate to today's situation, was the formation of, at the university, ethnic enclaves, which,
Really?
so to speak, they call them student unions, but essentially that's what they were. Different ethnic groups, almost explicitly only associating with each other, sometimes down to ridiculous detail. So I remember distinctly two versions of say Chinese and Koreans in the university setting. You had the so-called fobs, fresh off the boat,
Right.
who would only associate with each other, but not talk to, say, the Chinese who grew up, the Chinese Americans. Same thing with the Koreans.
Wow.
And they were very, and then you had the Black Student Union, and take your pick. Pretty much, well, I mean, essentially every ethnicity that's not regarded as sort of European had some representation in that regard. And
I mean, they were trying to beg for funds. They were special interest groups. Let's just call it how it was. And I don't like, in today's climate, it's all about grievances of the past and a reshaping of history to push out what had typically been classic Western history. But at the beginning stages of this, as you're talking about, what was the advocacy for? What were they trying to achieve?
I think they were just trying to achieve what a lot of human beings do, a sense of belonging. I mean, that's the thing. It's natural. We've talked about this privately.
Right.
I mean, without going
Group
into
interest.
I don't really feel I belong anywhere. So maybe I'm just the outsider looking in. But I still understand that urge that if you have a student union or whatever, and people are like you, whatever that means. Typically, they're similar
Right.
in appearance. Sure. I mean, I don't think I didn't see any. What just struck me, it wasn't sort of political. It was just that how divided the campus was. That you could see Asian Americans only hanging with Asian Americans, Hispanic only with Hispanic Americans. Take your
That's
pick,
weird. It's
right?
almost like self-segregation was a natural
Well,
function.
And
Weird.
then going back even further, I saw that in New York City in the 70s, 80s, early 90s. And yeah, a lot of people self-segregated. And I think this is another thing that, this is kind of spilling over to the current year, but yeah, people had this dream that everyone was just going to somehow get along.
Right.
I mean, it'd be nice if they did, but I'm not so sure they are all getting along. And even though there was no hostility, it just, these people. So when I was much younger, I was kind of friends with this Korean girl, and her friends had issues with me because I was, well, not Korean. And, that to me, in my mind, was alien. Cause I never really, I'll be honest, I never really judged people on their ethnicity or whatever. But
Was this noticeable at the time, or was it, in retrospect, like, okay, that's what was happening? Because that's got to be an odd thing to experience. Certainly for the first time, like, okay. There's definitely
I
some
had
animus
been,
here.
look, I had been, it wasn't the first time. I had experienced exclusion to varying degrees, not being ever been part of any particular ethnic conclave, where you can associate with these people, but at some point in time, you get in too deep, or they won't accept you completely, because for whatever reason you don't,
Right.
you're not part of them. You don't want to participate in the ritual. So I'd seen foreshadowing of that, but I just thought it was really odd that just having a friend, maybe it's because she was female, maybe that's part of it.
Perhaps,
That was just an issue. But it all makes a lot more sense. I guess part of the things I'm trying to say is that not only being Generation X, being the guy who doesn't really belong, back then I didn't know that. Well, I kind of knew it, but I didn't really think about it actively. Now I realize years later that I don't belong, and I never did, never will. And so all of it's a lot clearer to me. We all tend to, I made this video, right? Extrapolate from ourselves. And when you're 18, 19, you don't really think about it. You just sort of, you assign your own motives and your own MO to other people.
Right.
Even if you're the exception or the weird guy, and I'm the weird guy. Whereas there was actually the reverse. I was the weird guy and everyone else was normal. And what they were doing to me, whether they were excluding me or not, that was the normal thing. I wouldn't do that, but I was the odd guy, So, but it took me, quite some time to realize that was what was going on, rather than it's so strange. Why can't you? And I think that's much more normative now than it was back then. At least much more overt and, as we know, very, very pronounced. But I think, again, people use the joke about your country, flyover states. Maybe Gen X was just the flyover generation. All the cracks are emerging in the structure, all this stuff, but there's still people that are running off of the old system. So a lot of the helicopter parents most of them, I think, are Gen X.
That's right.
And things typically worked out for them. I think, again, and I'm not saying this in self-praise, maybe I'm the grand loser of life here, I don't know, but I was the weirdo. I'm the weird Gen X guy. Probably, I don't know what the percentages are, but probably there are more quote-unquote successful Gen Xers than there aren't. And by that I mean, follow the traditional model and it seemed to work out for them.
Sure.
But typically most of my friends are younger than I am, and so I'm also kind of in touch with what has happened to younger generations, where all these cracks become giant fissures, and you're just it's apparent to me now what happened. So many different things: a misreading of history, whether it comes to foreign policy, domestically. Because now we're going to your generation. You're a millennial.
So,
what's up with the millennials?
They're a real piece of work, Stardust. Real piece of work. The millennials, they don't trust many people. They like the state. They don't like having sex or getting married. The normal generational issues. Millennials have definitely had a huge impact, and we see differences between boomers and your generation, Gen X, in terms of their culture, the technological development. So disparities are obviously going to come, but I feel like millennials really started to break the mold when it comes to the traditional life arc of those in the modern world. And so there's a lot of negatives that come with my generation. The only thing that seems to be paradoxically a positive is that in terms of educational attainment, we are, by a good margin, one of the most educated generations ever. However, we still have less wealth than at the same age, because of things like student debt, housing cost, and everything else that comes with the economy, including the 2008 recession, which is actually when a good amount of the millennials entered the workforce. So we had perfect timing on that. But a lot of things seem to have broken down, and we spoke earlier about how there was a slow quote unquote evolution in the social sciences and the humanities in the universities, and I think it really came to a head when the millennials graduated. And so we see a lot of the progressive influence going all over the place in society, both in the corporate world, within the state, things like that. This is all coming from the millennial generation, and there's a lot of issues with it that I think we just simply weren't prepared for, and we'll get to the most, and what I think is one of the most interesting generations, Gen Z, because of their uniqueness.
Yeah.
But one thing I noticed is coming out of the 90s, and I assume it was like this around the world to some extent. You could probably help me with that. The 90s were a great decade economically, not just for the United States, but I imagine worldwide. Is that fairly accurate?
I don't in the West. Yeah, I was thinking about the Southeast Asian crisis in the late 90s, which decimated multiple economies in the early 90s, the Japanese zombie banking crisis. Yeah, but in the West it was pretty good. I mean, the 90s were the decade of optimism. I mean, everything was going well. Technology was improving, the internet emerged. Things were okay. Bill Clinton could play the
Right.
saxophone. So
All the big stuff.
yeah,
That's fair.
everyone was understandably optimistic. All on the heels of we beat the beast. Communism has fallen. I think the issue for your generation above all is all those minor cracks and increasingly large fissures that I noticed retrospectively. You got hit by them. I mean, by then the earthquake had already hit. All the stuff that was emerging, these
Right.
changes, you were I guess the full-time recipients of those checks.
Well,
Yeah.
one thing that we should mention is underneath all this is the slow escalation of technological advancement and how it's moving society quicker and quicker into a technologically entrenched world that's having a lot of effects, and we'll definitely get into that when we talk about Gen Z and the amount of internet use and social media and the problems that come with that. But where they were born with it, we kind of grew into it, and being able to adapt to that didn't seem to work very well for millennials in terms of, in 2008, the smartphone came out, or was it 2010? 2008, and the use of the internet and social media, especially for the millennial generation, didn't really pan out the way we wanted. As we can see in today's world, the idea of the internet, as was to kind of create this cornucopia of cultures and different ethnicities, and there was just going to be this huge mixture via the internet. Well, it didn't really turn out that way. Everyone just kind of picked their own side, and things kind of escalated, and we see the tribalism that we're dealing with today. And millennials were the ones to really push that forward. But I want to back up just one sec. The millennial generation is between, I think it's 19, just to get
86, I think. No.
81 to 96 is what
Is
I
it
see.
81? I'm pretty okay, man. I guess
Mm-hmm.
the dates differ. I always thought that Gen X goes up to 84, 85, but
Yeah, yeah. There's some crossover, and nothing's official other than the boomers because
right.
of the population boom, right?
Yeah.
What I have for Gen X is 65 to 80.
Hmm.
Millennial is 81 to 96, and then Gen Z is 97 to today. So
Right.
under that category, millennials are between 23 and 38 years old. I'm kind of smack dab in the middle at 28,
Hmm.
and there's a huge division in my generation politically and I would say culturally and even socially. The older millennials definitely have more of a traditional type of thinking, traditional type of life arc in terms of trying to get a house, trying to get a family, and although it's to a much less extent than the generations prior in terms of child rearing and home ownership and the normal what we'd consider the boomer lifestyle. The latter half of the millennial generation is definitely having problems, to say the least.
Hmm.
There's a lot of political division. There's a lot of turmoil. There's a lot of college dropouts. The latter half, and I can't figure out why this divide actually occurred. I don't know if it's because of the 2008 recession or something else, but this division definitely has a measurable impact on the way millennials operate and act in the world. And everything from, like I said, homeownership, religiosity, marriage, what their potential life outcomes, what they want to be, their aspirations, everything's very, very, very different. And it's all really not panning out the way we thought it would, as you can probably tell.
Yeah.
Everything,
Yeah.
you see what's one of the statistics that I found that I thought was kind of odd is millennials are actually some of the most politically disengaged of any generation at their age. However, the ones that are politically engaged are also the most radical, coming from both sides.
Hmm.
So there's really no middle ground when it comes to the politics of it. But even things like social trust, like millennials, um, yeah, millennials more so than any other generation at their age have have a very low threshold for social trust and trust in others, where the boomers at this current age gap thought that around 40% of people can be actually trustworthy or trustful, according to this Pew research. Only 19% of millennials think that. So that, despite having a very pampered childhood on average, we coming into adulthood, if that's what you want to call it, because there's seemed to have been a prolonged adolescence, if you ask me. There's a huge lack of meaningful connection when it comes to the way millennials are interacting in adulthood, and you can see this by things like the marriage rate, things like child rearing, things like making long-term investments like home ownership. Millennials seem to be stuck in this malaise of meaninglessness, and a lot of it has to do with technology, a lot of it has to do with student debt in the economy, and a lot of it has to do with the way the political mechanisms that led up to this point have affected our generation. So as a millennial, and on behalf of speaking for my generation, I want to apologize to the world for everything that's happened, because we seem to have not really been able to stay on pace and stay where we should be in terms of our life outcomes. And some of it is, some of it isn't. We're known to be the whiners, the people who complain about a lot of things, and there is some validity to it, but a lot of it is, what are you really, like, as a generation as a whole, I don't really think we're putting our best foot forward, and we're more apt to complain or reach out for the government, where prior generations, even if they had different circumstances, didn't default to the, throw your hands up and there's nothing I can do. And a lot of that, did come from child rearing, but nonetheless.
Well, yeah, we've talked about, I guess we'll get into that in a bit, I guess, with the Zoomers, sort of these people's lack of scruples and morals. But I don't, well, for one thing, again, we're saying that all the stuff that I started noticing in Gen X, these things really hit you full throttle. It's like a Mack truck.
Yeah.
So the promises of old that were not made good on, which sort of, kind of off and on sometimes they were made good on in Gen X, largely were not at all. And you guys were just sort of left to, throw up your arms. And I totally understand that. I think within going your own way circles, for example, a lot of the guys are millennials, apart from the ones who've been through the marriage system. So a lot of this stuff is just, what were you supposed to do? The promised land that was promised turned out didn't exist, and so you made this trek out there. You saddled up. You took all your rations with you. You took your funds, and you're going to arrive in the promised land. And what is it? It's a barren desert with nothing in it.
Yes, it is. It is a barren wasteland.
Yes. So what do you do with that? So it's not really, and people want to blame the boomers again. The boomers were just overly optimistic. Gen X were just lulled into complacency because the changes
kind of rode the tide of optimism from
Well, yeah, because the technology didn't. It was so slow. When you think about what happened between 1980 and the internet, not much. Think about what happened between the emergence of the internet and now. Tinder, Twitter.
We're moving at light speed now.
Yes.
The world is just continuing to move at a faster pace.
Yes.
I'm 28, and I feel like I'm 50 in terms of how fast the world is going, and that's one thing I'd also like to talk about in terms of the differences on almost every metric between me and Gen Z, because I certainly feel like there's a lot more overlap with the way Gen X and millennials were, or at least the younger half, were supposed to kind of. We have a lot more in common in terms of values, in terms of life aspirations, than the latter half, and certainly Gen Z. I don't want to say they're another species, but I have a hard time connecting. We'll talk about that. But what has been your biggest perception of how millennials have handled it? You did talk about how yeah, we were given a bad hand, especially when it comes to the increased competition and how educational attainment continues to slide down in terms of its reliability. I mean, as a man going his own way, like I don't really have to tell you too much about the dynamics between men and women and how they have just continued to decay. So yeah, there were a lot of things that were handed to us that we couldn't do really anything with, but we never came together as, in my opinion, as a generation to correct these things, to deal with these things. Like,
How could you? Think about
I guess maybe there wasn't a
think about it.
solution.
Think
Yeah,
about it logically.
perhaps.
I understand it's a lamentation, and you're a guy who, you want to do right, you want to fix the world, and I appreciate that.
A little bit.
Yeah, but that's a good thing. That's why I like you so much. But at the same time, again, we're transitioning. We go from the boomers to Gen X. We can't even notice the changes. They're too slow. I only notice them retrospectively. And you're the first recipients of these checks that are bouncing. Let's see, these bouncing checks, so to speak, right? All these promises made. So you're
Right.
getting all the government's going to send to you, and the checks are bouncing. They're not worth anything. And you ended up, packing your bags, you're heading out, and you're in the middle of wasteland. There's not an oasis in sight. There's no forest. There's nothing. And so what are you supposed to write? You don't even know what's going on. You guys got
Yeah.
hit by a Mack truck.
It's true.
It's a kind of PTSD, sort of. It's what just happened to us. And there's no explanatory mechanism because it happens so quickly. You get the internet and boom, everything's happening so quickly. All these promises
Yes.
made don't seem to be working out. And so it's not your fault, but there's a cognitive dissonance in in the millennial generation that it's a completely new landscape. So what are you supposed to do? Well, clearly the boomers don't have answers. Gen X didn't really pick up on stuff quickly enough. Jesus, if I had been a prophet, maybe I could have written a book. But I mean, I didn't pick up on all the stuff. And
Very few did, though. I mean, I'm sure there were whistleblowers, but as is always the case, they're ignored, and business goes about as usual.
It's not. I mean, I'm not a big fan of assigning blame and fault in general, but what were you supposed to do? You were given a really, really bad hand, and how are you supposed to come together and fix it? You didn't even know what was happening.
Right.
You're almost 30, and you're realizing pretty much now what's happened. And
Sure.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like it's just that we were able to realize these things a bit earlier than your generation, where these things were still kind of gradually becoming more of an issue, and so a lot of this went straight past and straight over the head of most of your generation who weren't paying attention. But a majority of the millennials who are entering their early 20s noticed these patterns and these issues starting to become a serious issue. I mean, I in my early 20s, I realized that marriage doesn't look like it's as good as it was, hashed out to be. And so, things like that I was able to become aware of, thank God. But with this earlier awareness, we haven't really adjusted to it. And yeah, we're kind of plowing new ground, but to what direction? I guess my biggest frustration is I don't want to leave as a generation more crap for Gen Z to deal with, especially when we talk about what they're going through and how they're dealing with their adolescence, and they're just now entering college, university.
I think
there's a lot of issues that are coming with that they're simply not prepared for, and their reaction to this is really, really concerning. In my opinion,
I don't think they're the direct recipients of the actions of the millennials. I mean, talking on matters of gender relation, gender relations is another thing.
Yeah, I will give that a pass.
I will say, one unfortunate characteristic of Gen X, I would say, is that a vast majority of us, nobody was telling this stuff. There were no Barbarosas back then. There were no.
Not to interrupt you briefly. That is the one thing I keep forgetting is, there was no internet. There wasn't this abundance of information at my fingertips, and so that's why I give you, your generation a lot more slack, because you didn't have all this information. You didn't have this globalized communication network where we know anything and everything that's happening in real time right now. at
Yeah.
our fingertips. And so these global trends and these patterns were way less noticeable unless you were a specialist or, in the upper echelons monitoring these things. So we don't really have that excuse. But you're definitely right when it comes to, gender relations and
Well, nobody told us
how.
about. You just were stumbling around in the dark. You screwed up multiple times. You know, it- really the realizations I've had over the years with regards to
Mhm.
women gender relations, they just sort of crystallized in what effectively had been the heyday of the millennial generation. It was I was well into my 30s when a lot of the stuff just really had sunk in. And I transitioned from this sort of skeptical, I guess what the modern term these days would be, purple pillar, millennial
Okay.
term, to just, wow, I wasn't just imagining all that stuff. Because when I was, that's the other thing with Gen X and younger and older millennials to some degree,
Mhm.
where I was the only guy noticing consistent patterns with women that I thought were just weird, and I'd be labeled a misogynist or whatever. And
Of course, of course.
yeah, and it's so it keeps on happening. And it's happening with this guy and that guy, and it's not just me. And what's going on here? And but there again, there's no internet. There's no manosphere, or at least internet manosphere. So you were the odd man out. You were that odd guy, just saying, oh, that's kind of weird, and you just noticing it everywhere. And
Hmm.
that's another huge. I mean, Gen X. I mean, Boomers forget about, but Gen X, we didn't really learn this stuff. The millennials were the first ones to sort of receive, you could say, the internet wisdom, or at least the knowledge and information that's available. Because there, yeah, as you pointed out, there was no global information network. It was just stumbling about, hit or miss, and a lot
Well,
of
that's
these,
why I
yeah,
think Gen X definitely gets a pass. Between that, the letting the good times roll from the successes of post World War II from the boomers, the success and the fall of the Soviet Union, the economic boom of the 90s. Like anytime there was a chance to kind of look around, like something else happened that kind of
yeah,
flashed you back into this, this positive trend of things are going to continue to get better and better. So who could blame you?
yeah. Well, I mean, I'm sure. In any event, my generation was largely just very unremarkable on the whole. No, bore witness to a bunch of things, but yeah, we just saw different events and probably just got lulled into complacency.
Hmm.
And all the really bad stuff didn't really happen, arguably, until the 2000s. I mean, you see, talk about foreign policy, Iraq, Afghanistan,
Right, right.
these are reflections of kind of, I think, American exceptionalism, optimism, the attempt to, we'll just bring democracy everywhere, everything will be fine.
Jesus
Obviously, didn't work
Christ.
out too well,
At the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives.
and lots of money and all sorts of other problems. Um, yeah, and I think that yeah, millennials are. I mean, I think the Zoomers are lost too in a way, but I don't know if the millennial generation could be salvaged. I don't think you're leaving anything behind in a way that it's kind of weird. And I don't mean this
I know what
disparagingly
you're saying. I know what you're
whatsoever.
saying.
The
Yeah,
Boomers,
yeah, yeah.
quote unquote, built something, and so did the Silent Generation. There's a kind of interconnectedness between the two. Gen X, I mean, I don't know. Again, we're sort of we're the forgotten generation.
You had denim jackets and acid wash jeans, so there's
Denim, yeah,
something
I
to.
had
Did you rock the '80s fashion?
a little bit. I actually was assaulted once because of
Oh shit!
my denim jacket. It was an interesting experience. Um,
Sorry to
no, it's fine. It
derail,
was a
but
long time ago. So yeah, no, there was some of that, but yeah, we didn't really. There's nothing. We didn't bequeath anything per se. I mean, arguably, I guess you could say that Well, it was as much boomers as anyone. The internet, the creation,
right.
and I don't think that because millennials find themselves in such a state of disarray. There's
Absolutely.
nothing.
That's exactly the word that I would describe my generation in disarray.
Yeah, there's
Um,
nothing you can bequeath to the next. I mean, you're not the direct. the Zoomers are not inheritors of what you're doing. They're much
Sure.
more the recipients of all the other stuff we've been talking about. If the millennials got blindsided, the Zoomers know what's going on, and they don't have a freaking clue what to do about it. You know, you guys are you thought things were okay. They clearly were not, but you didn't know what was happening. You couldn't have because it all happened too quickly. Gen Z knows that, but you know, I don't know what they're doing, and it's.
I guess that's the other part of it, though, right? Is as a millennial, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to look back and tell them, like, this is what you should do instead, because things are moving so fast. Things are changing so rapidly. The world is becoming more complex. The world is becoming more competitive. And, you know, a lot of them are at the age where the second chances are starting to run out. And, you know, where there was a time where get married, have kids, buy a house. Like, if that's not going to be it, there are alternatives, you know, like going your own way, but that's only one aspect of this. And you know, it only certain men are going to be open to that idea. I don't know, like, I don't know what to tell them. I'm trying to think of good advice to offer as a quote unquote role model or elder. I think I can start tapping into that title. There's just so much unknown in terms of how the future is going to continue on that it's hard to give solid advice because things are going to be changing more and more. But the one thing I can say is, like, this long-term investments and decisions and the lack of any sort of, you know, noticeable or measurable investment into the future from the millennial generation is certainly going to have an impact on Gen Z. It might not have been our fault, like things like, you know, the dynamics between men and women right now. That's just something that has been progressing for quite some time and shows no signs of stopping. But these effects are going to definitely have a detrimental effect. If there's anything I think I can hand down to the Zoomers, it's a lot more debt. And I don't. That's about it. That's the only definite thing I can say we're gonna hand off, and that's frustrating.
Yeah.
But it is, you know, it's no. Again, like, I've talked to a lot of you know, millennials. I've talked to a lot of middle-aged guys, not old guys, but middle-aged guys like yourself. Yeah, there's a lot of, there's not much to say because there's the amount of uncertainty, you know, seems to be increasing as time goes on. Does that seem reasonable?
Oh, sure. And the worst vice is advice. That should always be remembered.
Yes.
The problem,
wise words.
The issue, I mean, you know, that video I made about sort of manosphere guru, I mean, this is the problem, right?
Yep.
Because there's no reliable wisdom you can give anymore, not really, and no good advice, whatever that means, because I'm always very cautious about giving advice. There are people just out there who I think are largely predatory, but maybe I'm being too judgmental. Who
I think that's fair.
Yeah, who want to take advantage of the lack of certainty and the miasma we find ourselves in. It's just so difficult to navigate by saying that you got to do it this way or you got to do it this way, and just, you know, give me a bit of money and I'll show you the way. And people latch onto that because, again, there's no received wisdom anymore. There's no path. And yeah, that's the thing. I mean, this is the frustrating thing, and it's really frustrating for a guy like you who's really upright and tries to do right by people. But sometimes there's nothing you can do. There's no good advice you can give as a rule. You know,
stay out of debt. That's about the
stay out of debt. I'd agree.
Good advice that is legitimate.
Stay out of debt. That's kind of a time-honored universal. You know, don't get into debt. If
right.
Debt, right.
Even that, it doesn't have a novelty to it.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, it's true.
You know, what can you, maybe, you know, in cases where I've had conversations with guys who are really keen on getting married and having a family. Right. As I said in my previous video, which of course got demonetized because, you know, compassion in men is hate speech. But
shame on you.
Yeah, that I say, look, I'm going to level with you. You probably could have this, but these are the sacrifices you're going to need to make in order to have it with some reliability and lesser risk. And a lot of them, well, it's a bitter pill to swallow, no pun intended. That
right.
You're going to have to go to a country like this and marry something like that, and you're going to have to live effectively off the grid from Western civilization if you want any sense of security, and you're going to have to make sure she's economically dependent, all this stuff.
I know, it's quite the laundry list.
And that's just, if you really want that, and then some of them don't want to even bother, and some of them just have, I don't know, some of these guys who, I'll just say lean ethno-nationalists, have this bizarre thing that they're going to get some blonde, blue-eyed Nordic queen that's just going to, no, dude, you're living in a fantasy land.
Pretty much.
And all this other stuff, which people are still selling, like, Eastern Europe. Well, I had that conversation with that female, and yeah, we know what's up with that.
Right.
So, and this is, I think, part of the problem. I mean, people hate to admit it, but this whole reproductive game is a really big part of most human beings' lives. It helps shape certain things. Yeah, people pursue careers and do certain things, but
I would say in one way or another, it's the predominant, focus.
Yeah, for most people.
So for most people, sure.
If that's topsy-turvy, I mean, a lot of other things are going to be, too, that are connected to it. If you can't order your life in a way that's going to function, in a reliable way at least, well, I'm not sure what there is to do about that. And, I mean, this is something that this is maybe heresy, but you can't just tell every guy to just go your own way. Go your way, bruh. Yeah, man. It doesn't work that way, because not every guy has that mentality and is okay with that. Not every guy, can even make peace with that, because they have these desires.
It's tough.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, it's not always easy, and so it's not that you can't. So that's why I think you get, for example, phenomena like FA, who I'll distinguish them from incels. They want quote unquote quality relationships or whatever, but how many of those actually exist? And it's so I think
it's very telling of the times that that's an issue now, that's creating such just disaster for so many young men, because that was just a norm for 1950 to the dawn of civilization. Like this was, I mean, there was always going to be a certain percentage of men that weren't able to do this, but
yeah,
having or wanting a meaningful relationship, and knowing that divorce wasn't, flip a coin, you weren't gonna okay, I got to be careful with my words. You weren't
gonna get divorce intercourse, so to speak.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
And everything that comes with possible broken homes and children, all the things and stresses and struggles that come with that, the difficulties that creates, the data on that's very clear. None of those things really occurred. It was, you were in pretty good shape because the lady across the town was yours for the choosing. But yeah, now more than ever, and ever increasingly, those options that used to be just self-evident, assumed by everybody, is just no longer the case. And
well, there are a couple of things.
As you said, real quickly, as you said, though, not every man, even being aware of these things, is going to be able to go his own way. It requires a huge shift in what the traditional life outcomes for men are. And some men, who I'm jealous of, were able to transition and go their own way very successfully, very smoothly, and able to do the things that they never thought they could do, and live a life that was unrestrained from the traditional ways of being a man, and what roles came with that. But
well, you did a good job.
Like I said, that's I'm trying. Haven't saved the world yet, but yeah. But my point is that even with me going my own way, I had periods where it was difficult to make those adjustments, and it's hard. I'm only 28. Maybe she's out there. For intellectual honesty, I'm going to say maybe she's out there. But
Yeah.
The unicorns are becoming less and less, are more and more scarce. So that's not going to change with Gen Z. That's going to be even and worse. And so the simple things that you used to be able to hand down as wisdom are gone. And thank God there are people like you and Barbarossa and other creators who were able to give this type of information, to even offer an alternative that's not going to be universally suitable, but it's an alternative nonetheless that can provide a optimistic and fulfilling life outcome, a life alternative, a life path.
For some people,
but
I worry.
I wonder, and I guess this is a great point, because you talk to so many men, young men especially. Are you noticing a difference in the way this message, MGTOW, is becoming receptive to Gen Z? Because I think I'd like to pivot to the final.
Yeah, but
generation.
There's so much ground. I before we do that,
there's
a bunch of stuff that I would like to cover.
Yeah,
you talk about advice, and it's just really difficult to some of the things I've struggled with for years. Initially, maybe not so much, but as I've gotten older and older and been around for longer and longer, just thinking about the sense of moral responsibility I have with regards to a lot of men. Just maybe, and I have to concede this because it's concerned, maybe I've been more of a destructive force than a positive force. Maybe because I suck at optimistic messages. I don't really have them, and I can't really blow smoke up people's asses. And I'm not. So this is the thing. I don't think I've talked about this before. MGTOW. I've said the word. I guess demonetized. Whatever. Going your own way. It's whatever. And I was like, it's whatever. It's like they're out to get me anyway. But YouTube. Yeah. Going your own way is
bless their hearts. Right.
Yeah. Is not. For some people, it's just going to be just another depressing outcome. It's not a panacea to anything. You have to have a certain mentality. You have to appreciate a certain type of lifestyle. So I do worry about that because, there's a reason why the worst vice is advice, is because, you can give the wrong advice. And I don't even look at it as advice. I don't think you ever. I don't ever want to be seen as a role model, and I don't want people to ever really say he's saying to do this, because I don't know. I don't know you or your life, and it's very difficult for anyone to know that. But I do. That's why I made that video. I want to caution men out there, particularly young men, to not fall for the trap of what I call know-it-betters. These guys, maybe I don't know it all, but they know it better than everyone else, and they're going to tell you it.
And I think you've been very, very consistent and universal in that message, in the sense that I don't think any man who decides to go his own way, one thing I don't think any of them would ever say is, well, this didn't work out. Stardust told me that this was going to be this, or, this. It was always about informing men about the potential risk of cohabitation, of marriage, and how, and what the patterns that are associated with that, and how it can be very detrimental to men. And you've always laid out every possible aspect of how that could be them. And then I feel like you always gave the caveat that, look, I am presenting this information. It is up to you to decide whether or not you want to take it. It wasn't like, this is way better. But I mean, looking at it, I decided to go my own way because I looked at the potential risk, the potential benefits, and I mean, the open-endedness of going your own way alone, for me, outweighed the potential risk of divorce, of a broken home, and everything associated with that.
I mean,
that's just given the current trends of marriage. And so,
speaking of unicorns, I was talking to some guy the other day, and so I've been out of the dating market for eons, and he was, I think he's in his late 20s, early 30s, showing me he's from the Midwest, some local profile from OkCupid, kind of pretty girl, and I read the profile. Single, age 27, single mother of 3, something, something, something. I'm not looking to play games anymore.
Bail out, man.
Yeah.
I don't know who you are, but don't do it.
Yeah, no, it's pretty. I mean, but that's, I mean, that's the thing. I'm hoping to get a conversation going with Monday soon about this. But I think that
Monday's been great about, like, it's the quality, not the quantity. Even even if it's a higher priority for you than a man going his own way.
Absolutely. But that's the thing, is that the way, and I'll say more about this, and then we get back to trend, because we're talking mostly about generations. A bit of a tangent, but
yeah.
There might be partial unicorns there, by percentage, whatever, but it's the way I look at it. It's like, let's say you had some weird fetish that made you obsessed with women who are 7'3". Well, there's probably 1, 2, 3, maybe 5 women like that in the world, but do you really think...
Well, I have to be honest, that is my fetish.
Well,
Stardust.
it's no problem. I respect.
I'm an Amazon kind of guy. So.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's gonna be hard to find that, and the same thing with these so-called unicorns. I mean, maybe neuroatypical women. The chances that you're going to find them, is it then worth searching for it continuously? So, I mean, there's that. But it's just difficult to really even capture the immensity of how much men have been affected by that generational transition.
Yes.
Because it is an absolute wasteland, and arguably for women too, albeit for different reasons. I mean, they don't have the same self-awareness, and they have not been.
No, but
yeah.
and I mean, it's a two-way street, to the extent that the likelihood of successful marriage is, even though 70% of the time they're the ones who engage in divorce. I mean, either way, the likelihood that they're going to find a successful long-term relationship is equally as dismal. However, the amount of positive trends for women, whether it's wealth, educational attainment, happiness, all that, is complete inverse to what's happening to young men. And that's really frustrating, and that's why I'm glad that things like MGTOW do exist.
Yeah.
As a way to avoid these type of things. Like, it's frustrating. I'm preaching to the choir, but
yeah, but I know I know how frustrated you get. Now, thing you mentioned about Gen Z and how I find them typically less receptive to some of the stuff that millennials were with regards to MGTOW stuff, since the cat's out of the bag. Because YouTube is gonna nail me regardless for this video. For MGTOW stuff, manosphere, they're sort of almost less informed. They try to be edgier, but they're not as cautious, and they're all really really woke, I guess, in different ways. And they.
Do you think it's the lack, or do you think it's more age related at this point? Where, if I can just briefly look at that.
When does the Zoomers start again? Are they 96, 90?
96 is the general.
Yeah.
96, 97. So a lot of them are still in high school. The oldest are entering, or halfway through university. But I would say, or I hope at least, that this lack of receptiveness to the message is more because of the lack of serious relationships that they've had. They haven't actually felt the wrath of the modern female, and therefore don't understand why it's such an important issue. But I also think that after 3 generations of steady but consistent divorce, that they also realize, like, yeah, this isn't something we want to do. We've watched the rest of you on the whole really crash and burn, and so maybe it's more, it's already kind of built in. But I think a lot of it is also a general disinterest in being aware of these things. It's hard to tell. Like, this is also part of my frustration with Gen Z, is trying to understand what their conception of these type of major decisions are, and a lot of it, I think, is just this apathy, and we can kind of get into why that's actually happening. But yeah, like you said, there's a difference in the way this message is absorbed and received. Do you think that's going to continue, or how do you see that playing out?
I think it's going to continue. I think there's a kind of unjustified optimism in the Zoomers that because the millennials felt the brunt of the failures of the vision of the boomers and what preceded them. There's something weird about a generation where all this tech is just normal, where Tinder is just a normal. This is a normal. It's totally normal. It's like going down the shop, picking milk up. Oh, I'm gonna check my Tinder. Okay.
Well, it's not even go down to the shop. It's let me hit up an app that's going to deliver that milk to me. It's so far, and this has got to be my biggest concern, and I think from this alone stems into the distinctions I'm already seeing with this generation is where millennials grew into social media and smartphones. Gen Z was born with it. Gen Z was born in and on the internet, and it's pretty noticeable. Whether it's the way they're interpersonal, and I don't mean this as a negative. It's just it's different. It's different. There's a bit less, importance to having certain decorum or certain norms when it comes to conversations and taboos and things like that. And I think in some ways that's a good thing because, personally, I think it's a pushback against the PC culture. But on the other side, I think there's going to be long-term negative aspects of that that are yet to be seen, and that's just one part of it.
They're very self-assured in a way that I think is unjustified by the circumstances. Maybe
what do you think that stems from?
Well, obviously part of it is the brazenness of youth, right? Young people,
yes.
They think they know it all.
Of course, didn't we?
Honestly, I'm not, and it sounds like I'm hung about bragging, but I never really was like that. But I mean, a lot of guys did. Yeah, sure. Most people, they just try. Yeah, that's it. I don't think there was no transition for them, as you pointed out. They were born into the iPhone, internet age. They've never known anything without it. So maybe that's part of the sort of false confidence that they seem to have. Things seem okay. And who knows? Maybe, I don't think there's any evidence for that, but maybe gender relations, for example, they're improving under our eyes, and they'll be fine with that. I don't think so.
No, I think it's worse, I think as much as I'm all for wishful thinking, nothing really seems to suggest that things are going to be getting better between the sexes.
Yeah.
And I wonder if it's just a acceptance and a complete, dismissive, like where I think our generations had the idea that marriage was still something to strive for or something that could be looked at as a goal in life. I think they're completely dismissed of it. And we know that certain data shows that the higher you are, the more wealth your family has, the higher you are on the socioeconomic ladder, the more likely you are to marry because money is such a factor. But Gen Z, notably across the board, just is not looking at marriage at all. In fact, like their studies from Pew Research show that their biggest life goal as a generation is actually job fulfillment, a career. Significantly more than anything else. And we all have, I think every generation had that as a top priority, but Gen Z just seems to be focused on the idea that it's going to be work and then the grave. I hope something else can maybe rise up as a meaningful goal to strive for, but
yeah,
that's their opinion of how their lives are going to go. And
But the difference is they were not fed, at least officially. I think by the time Gen Z's up and running, they're not receiving the grand predictions and visions of the boomers anymore. Not really. But here's the thing: because I think they know it's BS. They're not going to say, "Well, get married and go to university, get a job." They don't believe that.
Right.
So. I
Yes, I
wonder if
mean
it's
yes
part
and
of it.
no, because just like the boomers up until today, the biggest and this is also research has also shown this, that the largest amount of family pressure that they get in terms of what they should be doing is educational attainment. Like that's still the numero uno when it comes to what you should be doing with your life. And it does, despite everything saying that, this might not be as good as it appears to be, and unless you're going into things like STEM, your likelihood of having a high paying job as a result of your degree is significantly lowered. And yeah, it's we're just not waking up, despite generation after generation noticing a pattern here. Parents are still pushing Gen Z to go to college and get an education, a 4-year degree. Doesn't matter what it is, just get that degree, get that diploma. And that seems to be another recipe for disaster, especially because of all the changes that you've discussed in terms of things like potentially automation, the technological developments, the shifting in markets. One thing that I think just on a macro scale that is just going to hit everybody is our educational institutions, our political institutions, and our financial institutions, I don't think are going to be able to keep pace with the change. And a lot of people are going to be left behind. That's a whole other issue, but that's part of the problem, is that we're not making these adjustments for the younger generation, and they're going to be walking straight into this again. Yeah, and
Well, one
not
issue
many alternatives. So yeah,
we've talked about before is, I mean, people use this phrase pretty often, moral decay, but it seems that way too many people these days just they don't care, and they don't care about behaving in a decent way to people. And
yes.
that, I don't know, is that a generational thing as much as anything else?
From I can only speak somewhat anecdotally on this point, but one thing I noticed is that a lot more interaction, perhaps even a majority of communication with Gen Z, is actually online, is over the internet, is through a screen. And I think the lack of face-to-face communication pretty much removes a lot of the responsibility and acting, in good faith, with good manners, with proper decorum, with mutual respect. Those things are removed when you're speaking, as we are.
Yeah.
And so this lack of standards, restrictions, and norms of communication, especially over the prolonged period as we see, and that this is only going to continue. Digital communication is only going to continue. The lack of face-to-face interaction is only going to continue. Seems to have been very detrimental to the way Gen Z communicates with each other, to others, older or younger. They're a lot more, like I said, somewhat callous, not afraid of touching taboos that maybe you or I would never have pushed in a normal face-to-face conversation. The screen time, since they were born with it, since they started with it, since they've been with it through childhood, has definitely created this change. I feel pretty confident in that. I don't know what else it could be. When you're talking with someone face to face, there is an acknowledgement that there's going to be a certain level of decency between the both of you, that there's going to be this respectful reciprocity. That's all gone when it comes to digital communication. And if you've ever wondered what human beings are going to do when they're no longer, required to be decent to each other and can say whatever they want without any punishment or backlash, well, you see what we have today on the internet. Anything and everything. In many corners, it's just a complete Wild West, and it seems like a majority of the worst that maybe I think both of us have seen comes from the younger generation.
And as you point out, that is life, because their life is the internet.
Yes. Yeah, in fact, I'm often impressed at how much I knew that the younger generation would be more tech savvy than my generation, but it's exponentially higher than I thought it would be. And in some ways that's impressive, and again, some ways that's troubling, because we don't really know what the long-term effects of this are going to be. I mean, just medically, psychologically, we're already seeing a lot of mental health issues with the younger generation. In fact, I researched another, another aspect of Gen Z that I've been concerned about, and I think has been showing some sort of level of exposure in the media, but not much. But when it comes to like the biggest issues that teens feel they have among their peers, it's anxiety, depression, and bullying. And we see suicide attempts, and we're already demonetized.
Yeah, yeah,
already demonetized. Yeah, the amount of potential suicides and successful suicides among teens is significantly higher than it's ever been for other generations of that age, especially for women.
Yeah.
Jonathan Haidt does a good job talking about this in terms of how social media has had a much more detrimental effect to girls, to young girls and teenagers than it has for men. And a lot of that, is how women interact and how, it's not physical violence as much as reputation destruction and things like that. And the negative outcomes are becoming more and more clear. And there's just no response to this other than parents controlling screen time. But when you're born with it, like how do you break away? What else do you do? Especially when you're going to be the one to break away, right? As a Gen Z, as a Zoomer. But when you break away, like everyone else is still on their screens. Like, what are you going to do?
There's no place to go. I mean,
there's no other place to go. This is where everything is at.
I know a young guy,
especially for this generation.
Who is he's 15, so not even born in the 20th century.
I know.
An astonishing thing to me every time I meet somebody who doesn't. But I mean, look, I'm not going to say 9/11 was the most important historical event, whatever. But it's one of those things. When a 9/11 is a historical event you read about in a history book,
it's a pretty clear turn of the page.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it certainly. Yeah, and this guy, this 15-year-old, he lives in a very northerly state, far away from everything.
Yes.
And I mean, I think I'm sympathetic. If this kid were around my gender, what do we do? I mean, I guess he'd go out hunting. Maybe there'd be some people play football. I don't really know, actually.
He would.
He'd be bored
inside doing something, or being bored, or
maybe
being outside. Like, what other options did you have?
Whatever book was, but because he's more remote, even fewer options. So I get why he does what he does, and he's a good kid, basically. But he's the exception, not the rule.
Yes.
And there is no place to go if you want to reject Gen Z. So where are you going to go?
Unplug.
Who are you going to unplug with? All the people you communicate with, your peers, they're there. Everything. So who are you going to hang out with? Boomers, Gen X. I mean, it just, I guess in the case of this kid, that's effectively what he does typically. But no boomers. But it's
right.
It's one of those things. I totally agree. We don't know what the consequences are going to be, and you're right. Females, strangely or not so strangely, are suffering in their own way more than they ever have, because of the effects of social media. And
yes,
what wisdom? Even I lament how much time I spend online, and I'm definitely not a Zoomer, so I'm not really sure, but. As is always the case, I find it alarming that there isn't much more discussion on this. It seems like the powers that be are either catching on late or they just don't care one way or another about precisely this problem with the Zoomers. And really,
well, it seems to be, it's and this has kind of also been one of the overarching messages is, from the very beginning, and even prior to World War II, like the issues that that society was dealing with, and becoming more and more pronounced and more severe, were really just never solved. And so everything began stacking up further and further, higher and higher, and we still haven't solved these things. In fact, now I think in some sort of weird Cognitive dissonance will look at these things as a good thing, right? Divorce, good. Be independent, yeah. Like, who needs marriage? Kids, pff, it's all about the money. It's all about the materialism. It's all about, it's all about me and no one else. It's this the hyper individualism continues to become more and more significant when it comes to people's outlook on life, and it's had nothing but a detrimental effect. And I don't know, I'm somewhat of a doomer, if you're familiar with that term.
Yeah.
I would have to say that, other than, I don't know, I'm at a loss for words when I see younger men in their teens and things like that ask me for advice. What did you do? What should I do? It's just like, I'm with you 100% that I'd rather give no advice than bad advice.
Well, you're a Chad.
Under the most, unless it's the most basic things, I'm not sure. I'm at a loss for words, especially because their worldview is significantly warped in such a way that I don't connect with them on the same way. And I mean that in the sense that they grew up with the internet, where I kind of like walked into it, treaded lightly through my teens, and we're using it today. But I can't relate to someone who like a younger teenager who's from the very beginning, as for many of the kids when they learned to walk, that they were handed an iPad to watch a movie, and essentially you can just like imagine the evolution of man, that caveman to walking progression. Like, it's, instead of that, it's just a kid with an iPad, then with a cell phone, then with a smartphone, and then back to the PC. And
well, I think
to have that your whole, the last thing I want to say is that a lot of us older people are using technology like this a lot as well, but we didn't start at the very beginning with that, and we were able to have chapters of our lives where it, not only was it non-existent, it wasn't even a thought, and it's part of our daily life to one degree or another. But to have it from the very beginning, I can't imagine. Literally cannot imagine.
Yeah,
and it concerns me.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is, in your case, is less to do with generations and more that you're a good guy, and it's not we don't live in a world filled with good. So you see a lot of this stuff, and it really, understandably, it upsets you because there's nothing much you can do. I don't know what to tell these guys. I certainly, there's no career advice I can offer. I'm not a careerist, and don't get into debt.
Dare I say, learn to code too soon?
Maybe learn
not
to
soon
code.
enough.
If you can.
Being tech savvy is going to be nothing but a good thing, but
yeah,
that's such a broad category. I couldn't even point them into what direction, future markets and future trends of job availability is even going to be. And even then, the threshold to get into those jobs, like, can we do can we have a second try on this? Is that a possibility? Because man, the options are just running thin for a lot of people.
Yeah, and
it's frustrating.
It's frustrating, especially because you care a lot, and that's a good thing. But it's difficult when so few people do care. I honestly, I don't know. Don't get into debt. That's the only that's the axiomatic, practical thing you could tell anyone. But that's always been true.
I will say that on a more emotional level, I do tell them to spend time with the ones they love. Like, it matters. Spend time with your family, especially if you're on good terms. Try to rebuild these bridges, because the world does not care about you. The world owes you nothing and will give you nothing. And
the internet,
those that matter,
that's for sure.
Yeah. And so, to the few that care about you, love you, and think you matter, like, stay in touch, stay connected, because time only moves forward and we don't get a second chance. But other than that, and stay out of debt, it's like, all right, well, good luck.
Yeah, and that's it's definitely a brave new world of some sort, and I don't know what's going to happen. I think. Well, I think a final note. One of the more interesting things, interesting in a macabre kind of way, is things I've talked about with the cognitive divide. I think this will be the generation where the haves and the have-nots will be very much divided along the lines of the people who can get with the knowledge economy, whatever that turns out to be in the next few years, decades, and those who just don't have the capacity to go along with that, and they'll just fall by the wayside and unfortunately not end up in a good spot. But it'll be very apparent. And
I think you're right.
It won't be just older people who it'll just be people who can't really keep up, and it'll just be really clear. And we already see that with a lot of this whole concept of NEAT to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a foreshadowing, I think, of things to come. In the coming years and decades, I believe at least, it'll be a lot much more apparent. Some people really doing well because they have the cognitive capacity, they come from the background, socioeconomic status, whatever, and the other people just the opposite, doing really, really poorly. And there's not much you're going to be able to do for them because the world is going to leave them behind because they won't be able to comprehend it enough to keep up with it. I think that's actually going to happen increasingly.
Yeah, I think so. I think we'll move from the traditional, very top to the upper, middle, and lower class to more of a, as you said, you either have it or you don't.
Well, it'll be a
have and have-nots, and that disparity will become much, much more apparent.
It'll be an intellectual plutocracy of some sort, and I mean, I already see that forming, and this will go beyond the scope of this video, but I mentioned privately these other creatures that are basically interdimensional beings that kind of look like us, they sort of talk like us, but they're not really us. They do not know what pedestrian concerns are. They don't know what it's like to worry about money, to really worry about even dysfunction, whether it's in your own life or people you know. And by that I don't mean necessarily problem, struggle.
Just the normal stresses of life, those are non-existent for a certain group of people, and I can't literally imagine if I tried what that must be like.
Well, it's just like they can't either. I mean, I remember talking to one of these guys who was saying, "Well, you just invest in property." Like, dude, I don't have enough money to invest in property. Well, what do you mean? This was a trust fund kid, and his family's worth tens of millions. I'm like, well, yeah, I mean, you do realize that most people, they don't. And then when he listens to me, that's the fascinating thing. He's never heard of these things. The things I've talked about.
Probably like just a bizarre reaction, like what? What are you talking about?
Yeah. Single mothers, never heard of that either. Because I'm having this chat with a kind of guy, not say blue collar, but a normal person, like it's middle class, whatever, who had undergone spouseification, that concept, by his own mother, because that happens pretty frequently. In fact, I actually think spouseification is the rule. I've come to that conclusion to some varying degrees. Guy had never heard of that. Never heard of the problems of single mothers. Never. I mean, he's very sort of traditional. I said, actually, two gay fathers lead to better outcomes than single mothers do, actually.
Yep.
And he never heard of that. Never, just couldn't imagine what it's like just to have any concerns. Why don't you just move there? Well, moving requires money and capital and plan, because he moved from one place to another place on a whim one day, essentially. Well, not a whim, but we'll just move. Okay, fine. It's bizarre, but I think because we are talking, one of the fundamental things here, I think that's critical is that in the olden days, there was still some sort of economic, social interdependency. And, I mentioned this, I think, in a previous video about
Absolutely.
feudalism. This doesn't exist anymore. That's why these guys, kind of the new aristocracy, are just so cut off and estranged from everybody else, and they might as well be a different species of human being, because, as we all know, money is this is the thing. We don't really do this, since the videos are already demonetized, in MGTOW circles. But there are differentials you could use when you talk about what are the most successful marriages. Well, one thing, people from higher socioeconomic classes, for example,
significantly higher,
because the biggest issue
marriage.
Is money, right?
Right.
You don't have enough money. You struggle with money.
It's not everything, but man, it makes a lot of things easier. It makes
there's a German expression something's like, money might not make you happy, but it sure calms you. I'm doing sort of not a literal translation, but a sort of in the sense of it. But it sure as hell calms you down, and that's and that's the thing. We know that your functional IQ drops when you're in stress, under duress all the time, often due to money issues. Most marriages end up in the dumps because of, not all of them for that reason, but often money issues.
It's often a contributing factor. Yeah.
And I know you follow or like to listen to Sam Harris sometimes too, and we both listen to his nice podcast with his wife Annika. Now, Sam Harris's mother is worth $30 million. He's worth a couple. So he's in a situation along with his wife where he can take the time to shoot the shit with his wife about consciousness and how fascinating it is. But everyone else, these are not luxuries. So when you have enough money, and I don't just mean enough, like more than enough, when you basically just don't worry. When you can say, let's go to Hawaii. Okay. Let's move out. Let's move out to some nice area in wherever. Okay. Why don't we just do that? Let's invest in profit. Then
let's make a podcast.
Yeah, let's. Well, we're talking. We're looking at you, Weinstein Brothers. Yeah, I decided to start a podcast. Oh wait, you're not employed anymore. Where do you get that money from? No, I'm not saying the sky's the limit. You can still have problems, but it just takes off a huge weight on your back when you're not worrying about expenditures and what have you. And I don't begrudge them that. That's great. If you have money and you're lucky, it's fine. I'm not, I'm not a guy on the left. Oh, they owe me. But we have to be honest that this is a huge divide. And then along with that, what often correlates with a lot of money is higher IQ and conscientiousness and all those things that correlate on,
And I would say one thing that Sam Harris really made clear to me in a way that I hadn't really realized before is luck. There's a good amount of luck, and that's
my view. I think literally everything in life comes down to luck. You didn't make your genes, you didn't make your environment, who you're born to. I mean, everything. I mean, he's aware of it. I mean, think of all these guys. He's probably the most aware. I think he drives past Skid Row in L.A. or he drove past in this conversation with Jared Diamond. So he's aware of that, but yet I don't really see him. I mean, it's my pet peeve to talk about these issues, but when talk about marriage specifically, for most normal guys, it's a raw deal. It's risky. But if you're born into a multimillionaire family, well, it's probably a lot less risky. Divorce rates are lower. Stable parent households more common. All that stuff.
Every single thing. Everything.
Yeah.
I don't know of a negative variable or factor that has an inverse relationship with wealth. I mean, compared to, when it comes to the daily struggles or the common life goals, everything is easier.
Yeah, I mean, you hear the stories about the cokehead, rich kid, failure, whatever, they exist, but even those tend to be, if you have enough money. I mean, Monday's had a couple of these stories about some guy that was a school failure and he got his teeth knocked out, and his parents were
right. The next day, fresh set of choppers. Yeah, I mean, money will bail you out.
And they just send him off. And again, I'm not speaking from point of envy. I'm sure would I like to have more money, but I don't begrudge people that I don't get angry at the universe or dispensing.
No,
Different
your
lottery
point
results.
is clear that imagine how much more productive and how much more progress we could have if there was a little bit more connection and understanding
Yeah,
between the classes. It would be great. It
and
would
my
create. I mean,
worry about this
you know.
specifically is
Mhm.
people who do begrudge them, and it's understandable why they would,
Sure.
and then try to create, I guess, are antagonistic, and then, well, these people, I know apparently from direct conversation, they don't think well of us, the rest of us, I don't know what we are, the
Yeah.
plebs. They think, they don't think
Peasants.
the peasants, yeah. They don't want to talk to us, they don't want to associate with us. And I can understand that perspective too, but I mean, for one thing, Trump's going to get reelected because of this, among other reasons.
Yes, he is.
And the other thing is, no man is truly an island, even in this world. You can only live in separation for so long. And particularly in the case in the U.S., do you really want to create an all but name a non-United States? I mean, where just people living in gated communities. What was the name of the guy that Uncommon Knowledge talked about? He's been in California. He's been a farmer his whole life, but he's also a historian. I forget his name. You know what I'm
There,
talking about.
Yeah, I do. I do know what
But
you're
in any
talking
event,
about.
having seen the transformation in California over the past couple of decades, I mean, what are you supposed to do as the common man dealing with people that look down on you, that think you're, some of us people that are poor, we're not necessarily dumb. We just don't have the same money, and I don't know.
Money, power, authority, position,
Yeah.
legacy. All those things matter.
So I think what we're going to see also is an emergence of really a new phenotype, a phenotype of basically functionality. There'll be two. There'll be the non-functional, most people, screwed
Hmm.
up in all different sorts of ways, whether due to drug addiction and all the things. Take your pick.
Right.
Single parent. I don't know. That's such a people still use that. In the mainstream. That's the official euphemism for single mother. It was 99% of the cases, maybe 95. It's a single mother, but single parent households. But yeah, you'll have this. The majority of people, they will be the non-functionals, and you have the functional people. Those will be the super rich and well connected and smart, and they'll have overall pretty good lives, and the life of most people will be
Extremely good lives,
unrecognizable.
relative. Yeah.
Will
Yeah.
be unrecognizable to the rest of them. And that's what Charles Murray has been worrying about. I'm worrying about it more for the U.S. I mean, I see it in Europe a little bit, but it's in the U.S. where, frankly speaking, wealth disparity is far greater. Yeah, I'm worried about that, and I don't see people
You and me both.
coming together. Well, and I mean this in a good way, a patriot. Um, I don't see any good solution, and the unwillingness to. So I'll give you, that I've kind of been finally come around on this idea that, I mean, people are calling you're a communist now, no, but that tax cuts don't actually incentivize new jobs necessarily.
Yeah, not necessarily the trickle down effect we thought it would create.
No, I mean,
Turns out they just pile on the cash and
yeah, they give
keep
more
the
money.
investments circulating at the top.
Yeah,
Yep.
or improve on automation. Jobs are created because of need, really. Where there's no need, tax cuts aren't going to do very much of anything. So, and that's something that, I think is pretty factual at this stage. I just don't see, maybe that's a left-wing talking point, but that seems to be true. So, but nobody's willing to, it's going to be really weird in the coming years and
Mm-hmm.
decades where you just have basically two categories of people, two phenotypes, the non-functional, and there'll be all sorts of non-function. Some guys will be 400 pounds and obese. The other guy will be alcoholic. The other guy will be a drug addict. The other guy, this mother's got 4 different kids with 4 different fathers and all that sort of thing. Different
Yeah,
flavors of non-function.
Right.
And then and that small, tiny slice where everything is just great. So, and I think it's going to fly. It's going to fly under the radar for a long time. It's certainly doing it now.
I mean, I don't know when it'll ever come to public consciousness, and at the point that it is quote unquote taken seriously, like what are you going to do? Other than things like wealth distribution, there's not going to be any political will to change some of these social dysfunctions, these social trends, these patterns that, I don't know, are going to, by the time it becomes catastrophic and epidemic, it'll have been 85, 90 years in the making. Like, now we're going to deal with it. It's a mess.
Yeah,
it's a mess.
It's a mess, and people always react too late because of all the unforeseen consequences. I mean, this is true of any human action, as Dr. Soul likes to say, no solutions, only trade-offs.
Yep.
And everything we're doing now is kind of an experiment. Apart from the static level of technological development over over basically all of human history, things didn't change much, you know. If you were, a member of the Wubajubik tribe 1,000 years before, and you're probably still doing the same thing as the Wubajubik tribe.
Same old.
Yep.
Yeah.
Same
and I mean, you were efficient. You knew what to do. You knew how things were going to go. Must have been nice. Probably, it was probably tough.
Very dangerous. Lots of disease and mortality, but
there was some
structure.
Negative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's right. But
the
I think
predictableness of your life was almost a certainty, where that is never coming back.
Well, I know where you're from,
and never coming back.
You know, walking, driving by, you probably just see dysfunction every day.
Noticeably growing as the years and seasons go on.
In a couple of years and decades, that'll be the new norm. You'll get some odd people out, maybe, somebody from a different socioeconomic state class that's really smart and can maybe climb his way out. But I think this is gonna. I mean, you see this with what's happened in Silicon Valley, perfect example, San Francisco. I'm very worried for Americans and the United States in general because the unwillingness of people to work together too.
That's a big one. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't, as we've agreed, there's not much you can tell these people, these generations. It's going to just be, don't go into debt. Well, I mean, if you're a multimillionaire, that's not much of a concern. So I mean, it's basically it'll be a two-class society.
I guess that's probably why things have escalated. Despite these type of issues becoming pretty self-evident at this point, is we know that there's not enough collective will to reverse some of these trends. Take the relationship between the sexes and how that dynamic's falling apart. So if that's not going to happen, we know it's going to get worse, and we don't have another solution. It's just kind of I think a lot of people throw their hands up and just kind of throw the blinders on and hope that they don't get nailed by one of the social issues or financial catastrophe, and it's more of a fingers crossed type of society now.
Yeah,
every man for himself. Dog eat dog.
What option? Can you really fault people for that? I don't. I mean,
no. I mean, I think that's literally like their options. If you want to continue to live in the United States, certainly not exclusive of in terms of it being a problem. It's very prevalent elsewhere, but not to the degree it is here, and not to the extent that society is refusing to wanting to deal with it. And I mean, this is on top of the current political climate and everything else.
Yeah, it's not looking good. I mean, Europe has its problems, but the huge wealth disparity is not quite as bad. But
well, correct me if I'm wrong. Like, a majority of European countries have pretty good social safety nets. I mean, much higher taxes in the United States, but most that I talk to,
this is the thing.
Are, the trade-off seems to have been worth it, or at least it's preferable than when they look over here.
Well, as somebody who's lived in both sides of the pond, like, I mean,
right.
I'm not on the left, but I can honestly say I have a better life in Europe with the political structure is intact than I could in the United States. I would be I would be in grave danger, I suspect, in the U.S. Especially, I was mentioning you probably with some medical issues. No, it wouldn't work out there. And yeah, there are higher taxes. So I guess it's that whole notion of maybe the U.S. is the Wild West, and if you succeed, you succeed. But fewer and fewer people can do that there, right? That's the thing. It's not.
Yes. Yeah. I mean
yeah.
the margin for success just continues to grow thinner and thinner, and everybody knows that too. By the way, maybe there's a few people who are delusional, like the American dream is as bright as it's ever been, and some politicians will give lip service to it, but no, I mean if you're really trying to make a good life, make it big in the United States. If you don't know, if you didn't know before, now you do know. Yeah, it's becoming much more complicated and much more difficult to achieve. And the reason, we could go on for days about why that's the case. I think we've discussed some of them today.
Yeah. So I mean, but in Europe, I'd say that some of these safety nets are being stressed, and I'm not sure how long all those will be in place. There are worries about that too. Not identical ones to the U.S. They're slightly different, but
sure.
U.S. I think because the U.S. has been on top for so long. So when you're on top for that long, the only place you can go is down, I guess. So it's
away we go.
And it's gonna be an interesting decline, and I guess that's all I could say. Interesting, but I don't relish seeing the suffering that will emerge from that. It'll be very covert, and it'll be quiet, and people won't pick up on it, but it'll be there.
Yep.
It won't
sure
be
will.
Wailing at the gates. It'll be muffled cries more than that. So anyway.
Well, I'll try to expose that as much as I can.
Yeah, well,
it's worth noticing and taking note of, and unneeded suffering is not really in my to-do list, so to speak. It's something that I definitely think there's a lot of, and we can do with a lot less.
Yeah.
And a few things could really help out a lot, especially in the United States, but easier said than done, as we both know.
Well,
so
no one's willing to listen. I've borne witness to you being perfectly reasonable, trying to get people to cooperate, and then I hear exasperation because they're just too. I mean, their egos are too big or whatever, and they're trying to win some petty battle about it. And I've not seen you in action IRL, but I suspect that I can imagine similar things go down. Matter of fact, I think you told me some stories where similar things went down that way. So. Yeah. It's bad, but for the record, I'm glad the world has people like you, because
likewise,
there's too much darkness, so a little bit of light is better than no light. Anyway, everyone,
that's a good message to end on.
Yep. So we've said all the bad words with our quote unquote hate speech, so this video is definitely getting demonetized. I will be shocked if it's not, and if so, then I don't understand the system as well as I thought I did, but whatever. And remember, anytime you want to speak of anything on substance on YouTube, that's what they're going to demonetize. So anyway, everyone, thanks for tuning in, and I will check you out later. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.